Okay, again, welcome everyone. I'd like to introduce to you Alan Weinschel, our president, and he has a few words to say, and he will also introduce our speaker. Alan?
Thanks, Richard. Before I introduce William, I wanted to remind people about a couple of things. First, we're having our annual meeting in October by Zoom. Unfortunately, we did not feel comfortable going ahead with an in-person meeting, which was scheduled for Seattle in October. And it's October 9th and 10th. It will run for 3 or 4 hours each day, and it'll be at a time similar to this time, probably a little earlier, that will work from the Pacific time zone all the way to Europe. I'm sorry, we can't do better than that, but it will work. We have some great speakers, including Leica lens master Peter Karba, who will be on with us for as long as he would like to talk. If you were in Wetzlar with us in 2018, Peter's talk was the highlight of that meeting, and we expect no less from him this time. There's also going to be an interactive piece of this meeting where you will be given an assignment before the meeting and submit a photo, and those photos will be commented on the second day by both Tom Smith of Leica Academy and our member Sandra Eisert, who is a former White House photo editor, and that is going to be really interesting. There are also going to be some door prizes for all attendees, including a free Nick Tools license, some straps from Rock and Roll Straps, one-on-one tutorials from our own Brad Usick, another from Sandra Eisert, and more. That list is still growing of the door prizes. This is a members only event, and I urge you to sign up. The other thing I wanted to tell you about is on Monday, we opened, I know we're talking about old Leicas today, but on Monday we opened a sweepstakes for a beautiful brand new black M10R Leica. There's a 3-month wait for these in the market. There's been tremendous demand for them. It's a great camera, and we have one, which we paid for, by the way. Leica doesn't give them away, and you could win it. This one is open to all, and the proceeds of this one benefit LHSA as well. Somebody's got to win, as they say. Now for our speaker, William Fagan. William was born in Ireland in 1949. He has a Bachelor of Commerce and Master of Public Administration degrees from University College in Dublin. He had a career that was largely in the public sector. In the latter part of his career, he worked in the areas of regulation, consumer protection, and competition. He was the Director of Consumer Protection for the Irish agency. He held several senior positions in Ireland and abroad, and he worked in the private sector in telecoms in the same areas. William has been a very keen photographer for a long time, a collector of vintage cameras and other photographic items for many years, and he's the author of more than 40 articles online and in print in regard to cameras and photography. He has spoken at LHSA meetings, and I know we're in for a treat. William is a longtime member of LHSA. He's been nominated to serve on the board of LHSA. I hope you'll vote for him this summer when the election, which will be electronic, comes out. And he's also a member of the Dublin Camera Club, the UK Leica Society, the Photographers Collectors Club of Great Britain, and since 2019, he's been a member of the board of directors of the Gallery of Photography in Ireland. Very distinguished indeed. And I know we're in for a treat. William has some great things to show us and some insights about using old Leicas. And with that, I'll turn it over to William.
Sorry, I have to go into share screen here. Can you all see my slides there? Richard, can you see my slides there?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi.
First of all, thanks very much, Alan and the LHSA team for inviting me to make this presentation about a subject that I really love. Also, thanks for choosing what apparently is, I only discovered this half an hour ago, it's International Photography Day. And the reason why it's International Photography Day is because on this day, in 1839, the French government purchased the patent of Louis Daguerre to start off with the daguerreotype and make it available to the public generally. So thanks again for picking today as the day. I hope that you can all follow my Irish accent and my Irish sense of humor. I hope that you'll find something useful in this presentation. The scope of this talk is about choosing and using old Leicas. It's aimed largely at the smaller collector and the occasional user, but the more experienced collector and user might find something of use here. I'm using the expression collector and user. Some people who use old Leicas don't approve of people having cameras which they don't use. However, I am both, and I think that the collector and the user can be friends, to misquote Oklahoma. Old Leicas or older Leicas in this context means the LTM Leica thread mount or screw mount or M39 from 1925 up to the late 1950s, and also Leica M's, the bayonet mount that we're all familiar with, from the M3 up to about the M6. Also, I would be covering lenses, accessories, etc., all from my collection. There's only one slide here which contains cameras which are not in my collection. I'm going to go through them in groups of 3 and choose my own personal favorite, which could lead to something of a discussion later on. I'm not covering the Leica Flex and R models. I apologize to anybody who's come on expecting them. I don't have any. But I think that you will find that there'll be more than enough. In fact, more than enough for my 45-minute talk. I'm also not covering flash, just natural light. Flash would take much too long to fit in. I will cover film and some usage tips. Just one point before I go into the slides here, these slides will all be available on the LHSA website. So you'll have plenty of time to study them in detail. I also intend to produce a fact sheet to go with these, because I am showing a lot of images of a lot of cameras, lenses, and accessories. And I may be going maybe a little bit too fast for people to actually see and to appreciate what is here, but you'll be able to do it at your leisure later on. So starting to begin at the beginning, to misquote the Tale of Two Cities, we have here the very earliest, some of the very earliest Leicas. The first commercially available to normal customers camera was the 1 Model A starting from 1925. The camera on the left here is a 1 Model A from 1926. It has an Elmar lens, a 50mm lens. It's a very simple camera in many ways. It's a fixed lens. There's no interchangeable lenses with this one. It has lost its, just by way of comment, it's lost its black paint and it's fully brassed. It was like that when I got it, and I like it that way. It's no rangefinder, just a viewfinder, and it has no meter. Moving on to the center camera here, that's a 1 Model A from slightly later. This is a feet scale. This one has meter scale, and it is therefore close focus. This will focus down to 0.5 meter. This one will focus to 1 meter. This has on it an accessory rangefinder, which is also in feet. And what you need to do with accessory rangefinders, you need to transfer the settings, the readings that you get from the rangefinder onto the lens. Moving then to the right-hand side, here we have a 1 Model C from 1931. This is a camera with interchangeable lenses. This is actually a standardized one. It has a 0 on the lens mount, which I will show to you later on. And there's a 0 on the lens to show the two match. This has a slightly different rangefinder on it. It's called the focus, and this rotates to allow access to the shutter speed dial. My favorite here is actually, in this particular group, is actually the very basic camera on the left-hand side. It is photography as Barnack had originally intended. Moving on now to the 1930s, we have here three beautiful cameras. They are black paint and nickel. Lenses are nickel and the furniture is nickel. And probably the nicest finish ever on any Leica camera. These were the first Leica cameras to have a built-in rangefinder. In fact, when it was introduced in 1932, the fact that when you turned the focusing on the lens, the rangefinder image moved inside here. This was actually referred to at the time as autofocus. It has a separate window here for the viewfinder. This one on the left-hand side has a Hector lens, f2.5. It's the same camera in the middle with a Elmar lens. Now, one point I want to make here, and this is back to the collector versus user situation. The Hector lens will cost a lot more than the Elmar lens, but not necessarily because it is a faster lens, but because it's more rare. And that's something to look out for when you're buying old Leicas, that prices can often be determined by what collectors want as opposed to the utility of the lens per se. And then on the right-hand side, a very familiar camera, the Leica 3. This is one from the mid-1930s. Again, black paint with nickel furniture. And this one has an f2 summer lens. My choice here, by the way, this one also has, I should have pointed it out, the slow speed shutter dial, which we're all familiar with. But my choice here is the camera in the middle. I like, again, the basic nature of the 2 Model D. And another thing that I have a slight fetish about is I like a free right-hand side, if I can, on a camera. I prefer to have nothing there when I'm gripping it with my right hand. It's just a thing that I like. Moving on, I mentioned there about collectors and users. How you know you've become a collector is when you already have 5 or 6 2 Model Ds and you buy another one just because it has an engraving from the city in which you live. This was actually sold in Dublin, according to the Leica archives, in August 1932 from a shop which is no longer there, but I have used this rig to take a photograph of the building from which it emerged, number 50 Grafton Street. At the time I took the photograph, it was a makeup shop and not a camera store. Moving on further into the 1930s, we recognize chrome cameras, which is something that is very familiar to all Leica users. The first camera on the left-hand side here is actually a Chrome 3, very similar to the last one I showed. It has a feature which you cannot see on this slide. It has a thing called bright chrome, and it was a finish that they used for about 3 months. But that was a pity because this bright chrome looks like it came out of the factory yesterday. In fact, the chrome on this is in better condition than the chrome on my M10. Later cameras like the one in the middle and the one on the right-hand side have satin chrome, which marks up slightly more. One of the differences between this is a 3B and this is a 3A. The differences, one of the big differences between these cameras is the maximum shutter speed, which is 1000 on these two, and 1500 on this camera and all of the other cameras you've seen so far. The other difference between the B is that the B has the viewfinder window and the rangefinder window close together, and whereas the A has the viewfinder window and the rangefinder window slightly apart. Just that device that's on the B in the middle is called a Nookie. I'll include this on my glossary list. It's for close focus. You can focus down to 0.5 meter with this. My favorite of this group is actually the 3A. Before the 3C, which you'll see next, I actually preferred cameras which are slightly further apart. I do have eyesight issues. I've had a number of eye operations myself, and I actually prefer the viewfinder window and the rangefinder window to be slightly separated. Moving on here to the 3C. The 3C is a slightly wider camera by about 3 millimeters. It is also a die-cast one-piece structure at the top, probably for more ease of manufacture and also for basically greater strength. This one on the left-hand side, it's a wartime Leica. The fact that it's in gray paint does not mean it was military, because it's not. They ran out of material for producing chrome during the war, and therefore they switched to gray paint. This is a 3CK, the K standing for Kugellager. Again, I'll include it on the fact sheet, the German word for ball bearing, to give a smoother shutter and also to assist in temperature extremes, I suppose the best way of putting it. One other feature between the wartime 3Cs and the post-war ones is that the wartime 3Cs have the rewind lever on a tiny little step there, and hence they're often referred to as stepper models. Here in the middle, we have a post-war camera from the year I was born. It is a 3C. It has what is called a shark skin finish, but it's very hard to see this on the vulcanite. I can just say to you is that a shark skin model will have extremely hard wearing vulcanite, and the grip is absolutely fantastic on it. This lens here has a Summiter lens, which is a lens, a f2 lens, which replaced the Summar. And on the right-hand side in this particular group, I'm showing a Leica 1C. The reason for showing it is to show that the one models without the rangefinder continued up until the 1950s. This one doesn't have a viewfinder even. You have to use a supplementary one like this SBUI, and you can also fit a rangefinder there if you want. My choice from this particular group here is actually the camera in the middle, because this camera is exactly 3 days older than I am. It was delivered 3 days before I was delivered, which is nice to have. I don't think I'll get one for my actual birth date. Moving on into the 1950s now, to the F models, which again are probably more familiar to a lot of members. The model on the left-hand side is actually a converted 3C, converted to a 3F black dial. And the black dial refers to a dial which is under the speed dial, and it's used for flash sync. In a later picture, later in the presentation, I'll explain the purpose of that. This one is also mounted on a Leica bit winder, and again, I will touch on that later on. In the middle here, we have the 2F red dial. The 2F red dial has a slightly different shutter, different progression. It goes 1/25th, 1/50th, 1/75th, 100th. This goes 1/40th, 1/60th, 100th. And it is a slightly more refined shutter. This one has a device on it here, this orange filter over the rangefinder window. It's called an Ocaro. And the purpose behind that is to increase contrast on the rangefinder window of cameras which don't have, maybe the rangefinder lenses or mirrors are slightly worn. On the right-hand side is a camera very familiar to a lot of people. It's the 3F red dial. This one has all the attributes, the slow shutter speed, and also the self-timer. This one is fitted with a 35mm Summron f2.8 lens and an S-Blue finder. It's a very nice camera. But my favorite again here for this right-hand side thing is I prefer nothing under my right hand here is actually the 2F. And that is a camera that I use quite a lot as a user camera. And I will show you later on how I actually use that camera and a photograph I've got from it. The final LTM model I'm going to deal with, the final screw mount model from the mid to late 1950s is the 3G. Some people feel that this is the most complete one. They're very nice cameras. This one has a nice, in its viewfinder, it actually has a frame line like the M3. This camera was actually introduced after the M3. I'm not hugely fond of the 3G. I prefer some of the earlier models, as you might have gathered. I just don't gel particularly well with it, but it is a very nice camera and a very nice camera to use, and I've got some great shots out of it. One feature about this camera I want to show is this lens, this Elmar lens, which is on the camera. The Elmar lens, which is here, is a red scale Elmar lens. It's a slightly improved version, which was introduced in the 1950s. And sometimes people pay a lot of money for these, My view is that they are a slight improvement on the standard Elmar, which has a black scale at the back. I would say pay a little bit more, but not a huge amount more if you're buying one of those. Now on to very familiar territory for most people here, which is the M models. M standing for Besucher. If I'm pronouncing it correctly, German members can correct me on that later, meaning rangefinder. The big feature here is that in the rangefinder window and the viewfinder that they are combined. And they also have frame lines inside. In the case of the M3, which is the very first model from around 1953-54, it has frame lines for the 50, the 90, and the 135. Other features of the M3 camera were the bayonet mount. Here, this is a Summerit f1.5 50mm lens, which meant that taking off and putting on lenses was much easier. They also had a wind lever, and this particular one here has a double stroke. It's one of the early ones where you have to wind the lever twice. I think Leica were afraid initially that the gears would stress the rest of the camera, but in fact, they continued this for a number of years. In the middle is a camera called the M2, which is actually slightly later than the M3. It is a camera maybe made to maybe slightly less of a standard, but it's still a fantastic standard of build. One of the features it has here is that you have to set the film counter, whereas here it's an automatic resetting on the M3. This one has different frame lines inside. It has a 35mm, a 50, and a 90. It doesn't have the 135. This is a particularly nice version of the M2 because it has this button rewind, which I find much nicer under my hand, again with my right hand fetish, than the lever rewind. This one here, because it has the 35mm frame lines, I'm showing it here with a 35mm Summerit f2.8. It's the M mount version of the LTM one I showed you earlier. On the right-hand side here, we have the M4. This is slightly different. One of the main differences you'll notice immediately is on the rewind. It has a rewind spindle with a lever on it, as opposed to the knobs on these two. It's slightly faster to rewind. It also has all of the frame lines which these ones had. So it has 35, 50, 90, and 135. It's a very nice camera, also built to a very similar standard to the other two. The lens which is on this one is an Elmar f2.8, which is a more modern version of the Elmars I've been showing you before. My choice, by the way, on that previous slide, I went on too fast, was actually the M3, but I would give it a great shout out for the button rewind M2. Moving on here to these cameras, and some people say, are these old? These are old Leicas. The M5 here on the left-hand side, which was the first Leica to have a meter inside it, is actually introduced in 1971, which is 49 years ago. It had a battery, and you could set the ASA or ISO or DIN. It had a meter which came down on a lollipop. I'd love to be able to show it to you, but there really isn't time in tonight's presentation. We could do a whole session on the M5 alone. It's a CDS meter. There's match needle inside here, and also you can see the shutter speed that you have set. Again, a lot of people like it. It's a nice enough camera to use, but again, it's very large. And I also find it somewhat unbalanced to use, even with this lovely rigid 50 Summicron lens. In fact, I find it even less balanced than the Nikon F, which was around at the time. And so did a lot of other people, and it was not a good sales success. Nearly brought down the company, and they had to reintroduce the M4. And then 2 years later, in 1977, they introduced another version of the M4 called the M4 II. The M4 II, some people say, is made slightly cheaper build, but I find it is better built than any other camera of its era. It doesn't have the self-timer here, but it has a hot shoe at the back. And this particular one was made in Canada. And then on the right-hand side here, we have the M6, which was the first camera, Leica camera with a meter, which actually really worked very well, it's basically similar to an M4, but it has LED arrows inside which can be matched to meter the camera. It is actually a very fine camera. This one actually has on it a 50 summicron dual range without the goggles. It is a lovely camera to use, and it would, strangely enough, be my choice of this particular group, the M6. Choosing. It's very difficult to advise other people about choosing because only they know what they want. My view is that if you want to seek advice, there's plenty of people in the LHSA who can advise you. There's Jim Lager, who's the author on many, many books on all things Leica. There's Lars Nettepel, who's not only an author of many books, he's from Germany, from Wetzlar, he's a Leica dealer there, and he's also an auctioneer. Another person I want to mention, and I apologize for all David Farkas and all the other ones I'm not mentioning now, is Dan Tamarkin from Chicago, who's both a dealer and an auctioneer, and I'm mentioning him because I knew his father, Stan. My view is that if you can go to a dealer and try them. I know it's very difficult at the moment in the COVID times because people can't travel and people mightn't be able to get out to do this. And my advice is also to bring along a lens that you might want to use, same with accessories. You also need to ask questions like, do I need a fitted rangefinder? Do I need a meter? What top speed do I want? What slow speeds do I want? What flash sync? Going on with this, a lot of times the price is determined by the cosmetics, by the condition, but cosmetics never took a photograph. It is the actual physical condition, mechanical condition of the camera that counts. So you need to get either a warranty from the dealer or factor in the cost of a CLA, clean, lubricate, adjust. And going back up here a bit, auctions generally are for collectors like me. If you really know your cameras, know what you're looking for. However, you may end up paying more at an auction because that you're competing with other collectors. Likewise with eBay, the way I always say is that eBay is for people with strong nerves. Now, some people worry about fake Leicas because there are some about. This is the slide where I'm actually showing Leicas which are not in my collection. And these are, and most people, a lot of people recognize where they are. They're actually in the hallway of Leica headquarters in Wetzlar. These are fakes, probably largely of Russian or Soviet Union origin. Fakes are cameras which are marked as Leicas, called Leicas, but are not Leicas. These ones have some features you would never see in a real Leica, like the eagle, the Reichsadler, or the swastikas. I'm only going to deal tonight with simple fakes, not with sophisticated ones. You need to go to somebody like Jim Lager or Lars Nettepel if you're going to discuss sophisticated, expensive fakes. In addition to fakes, you have things called Leica copies. In this case, a Leica copy is a camera which is made to look like a Leica, is made generally on the same lines as a Leica, like these three ones here, but it is not a fake. It's not claiming to be a Leica. It has the name of its actual manufacturer on it. Interestingly enough, in my researches, I've never found a case where Leica actually sued anyone for breaching their copyrights with such cameras. The one on the left here is a Fed Zorki from the Soviet Union with a Jupiter 8 lens. In the middle here, we have a Reed from Great Britain, which has a Taylor and Hobson lens. And on the right-hand side here, we have a Leotax from Japan with a top car lens. The Reed is a lovely, lovely camera. One of the problems with it, though, is getting spare parts to repair it. And my one, in fact, has some Leica 3A parts inside it. It's very, very hard to get them. I know one day I saw somebody, and I'm not going to mention his name, who had a whole box full of them, but he wasn't letting them out onto the market that readily. My choice actually of these three cameras, I might as well do a choice here on the copies as well as on the actual Leicas themselves, is actually the Leotax. It's a lovely camera to use. And this top car lens is absolutely super. My optician uses a top car lens to examine my eyes. So if it's good enough for my eyes, it's good enough for my photography. Now, to go on to here, I'll let you have a look at this. This is one of my tests for telling fakes. I call it the banjo versus balalaika test. I'll explain how and why. What you're looking at there in the middle is the rangefinder cam, which is the bit that moves, that the lens moves when it is focusing. And this lever here then moves the lenses inside in the rangefinder to give you the coincidence that you need. In a genuine Leica, which this is, it'll look round like this. In fact, it'll look like a banjo. And that's why I call it the banjo versus balalaika test. Just one point about this lens rim here, you'll see this lens mount, you'll see the 0 here. This indicates that this is a standardized camera, and that if the lenses have a 0 on the side of them, like this, it'll mean that they will match. Moving on now to the balalaika end of it. The balalaika is a Russian musical instrument, which has a triangular head on it. It's a bit like a mandolin or a guitar. And the Russian-made cameras often have this, pardon me, I'm getting a bit dry here. They often have this triangular rangefinder cam. This is actually not a fake, it's actually a copy. It's a Zorki 2C. And it's actually a very nice camera. But this, if you see this, immediately you know you're not dealing with a real Leica. I'm going to move on to lenses. Now, the lenses for Leicas mount into the hundreds and hundreds. This is only a small selection that I'm showing you here. And I'm trying to show them together also with accessories for lenses like lens hoods and viewfinders. In fact, I could probably, if I was to do a presentation on Leica lenses, either LTM lenses, such as these ones, or the M lenses, which are coming up next, we could probably do a 10-hour presentation on them. The first one on the left-hand side is the lens that made Leica. One of the reasons why you have M10s today is because this lens made Leica a huge success. It's the Elmar, the collapsible 50mm lens, designed by Max Barek, and in fact, partly also designed by Oscar Barnack himself. Just showing you here just a couple of lens hoods for it, called Fison or Fison. One of the unusual things about it, this is the very first Leica lens hood from the mid-1920s. It was actually square, which meant that when you focus the lens, you had to readjust the lens hood. So I don't know what they were drinking in their coffee in Wetzlar that day, but they soon changed it to this round one. Moving on next to this camera here, it's a Leica 3C, another shark skin model. It contains a 28mm Hector f6.3 lens, a very large Soon hood. Here is the viewfinder for it, which is a viewfinder, which has on the front a screw-in attachment called a tuvu to give the 28mm point of view. Just in case anybody's wondering what this strange item here is, I believe, I've never used it, but it came with the camera. I believe it is for connecting two Leicas to the one remote cord. Moving on here to the lens in the middle, it's a 73mm or 7.3 centimeter, as we'd say in the old money, f1.9 lens, which would be a very fast lens even by today's standards. That's the hood for it. But I just want to show you here the viewfinder for it, which is rather tiny. It's called an Albada finder, and there's a range of them, including one for the 28mm, which I have, but I didn't have it out when I took the photograph. This one here will actually fold up and go into a small little purse, and it's actually tiny when you fold it on top of the camera. Moving on then to the right-hand side, this is a 90 Elmar, very familiar lens also to all Leica enthusiasts. One of the reasons why I'm showing this is because I have beside it a Ficus lens hood. This is basically a zoom lens hood. This one has settings for 50, 90 and 135mm, and you can just push it up and down and then lock it. And then finally on the right-hand side, there's a VDOM finder, which will actually do these two lenses and also the 50. It is a very early one. One of the issues with the VDOM finder, however, is that when you use it, you'll find that the image is reversed, unlike in the VU, which is reflex, where it's put back the right way around. Moving on to M's. Again, these are just very much by way of illustration. These are just a small number. Somebody actually asked me a question today, which is actually, I think, answered in this slide. Number one, it's the size of the hoods. That's a Zunz hood for the Summerit 50mm f1.5 lens. There was a fashion with Leica for a while for huge lens hoods. During the 1930s, there was one called the Sump for the Summer lens. And also there was a barn door hood for the Scimitar. Moving on to the camera here, that's a single stroke M3, and it has on it a 35mm lens, but of course this camera has no frame lines for 35mm. So one solution was to have a 35mm Cimarron lens with inside a pair of goggles between the camera and the lens, and this turns the 50mm inside into a 35mm frame line. There are other solutions, such as using this S-Blue finder here, which you can put on top of the M3 and use with a conventional camera with a lens without goggles. This is not as bad to use, by the way, as it might look. It looks like a bit of a handful, but it actually works very well. Moving on, and again, I probably should have put this the other way around. This is the dual range Summicron, which also has got goggles. The purpose of the goggles here, however, is not viewfinder, but to make the close range part of it, going from a meter down to half meter, to basically to make it operate on the lens. Again, I could do a whole talk on this lens and how to use it. The other thing I'd say about this lens is an extremely sharp lens. It's as good as any modern Summicron, I'd say. We can talk about that later. And then there's the 90mm Elmar M mount. I am showing this is to show here that you can get separate viewfinders for some of these. Now the M3 had 90mm frame lines, but actually some of those finders, like this one, is called an SG VU. Some of these are actually much clearer than the frame lines inside in the camera. Onto a thing called film. I just talk briefly about film here. There's so many films. Again, it's a bit like the lenses and the choice that you have here, and everybody will have their own favorites. My most commonly used color negative film is Kodak Portra 160. For black and white, I would typically use Tri-X or a 100 Max. Ilford from Great Britain make very nice films. This is Ortho Plus, which is ISO 80. There's also FP4, HB5, XP2, a whole range of films. XP2, you can actually have, it has C41. You can get black and white photos at your local corner store if you still have C41 processing where you live. And then finally, this one, which I really like, and I'm going to show you some photos later, done with this film. It's called Fomapan. It's from Eastern Europe, and it is a lot cheaper, and it's actually a very, very nice film. The sharp-eyed or the eagle-eyed will have noticed this out-of-date Fuji film. I used to use Fuji. For some reason, it's not as commonly available where I live now. And likewise, this Kodak Color Plus is out of date. Like cigarettes, you can buy a packet of cigarettes, but you can also roll your own. A lot of people like to put bulk film into their cameras, into their Leicas. If you're using an early Leica, you would probably use these ones. These are called Filcas, which probably stand for film cassettes. These are made from brass, and they're very early. Again, you could do a whole presentation on these. There's a lot of lore about these. There's a later one also called the Ixmu, which you could use in the M cameras. I'm not going to go into any great detail about these, other to mention that I got a surprise out of one of them recently, and I hope to touch on that at the end. One of the reasons why a lot of guys don't like the early LTM models is because you have to trim the film. Here on the bottom of this one here, my 2F, you'll see the shape of the film that's required. The reason why you have to trim is to ensure that the film, when you're loading it, doesn't get caught up in the gear wheels, in the winding wheels inside. There is a template for cutting it this way called the Ablon. I don't really use it. I find it awkward to use. Some people say it's easy to use if you use a knife. I've seen Dan Tamarkin using one with a knife, and he looked very adept doing it. I generally, however, use the scissors. And in case you think that's right and wrong, there's no rights and wrongs here. There's a guy on YouTube who actually cuts the film with his teeth. And you should go and find him out and see what he does. Here is a cut piece of film. You're normally supposed to leave 2 sprocket holes here. I have a sprocket hole and a half here. One of the things just to look out for, don't leave any loose bits of film there because they might tear your curtain. You need to ensure that the film is put all the way into the spool on this side. This one here actually has a very nice little feature, which it has an arrow made out of dots where you can see the film going through. And then you put the 2 spigots on the outside and insert it into the camera. Now, my next one, this was a bit of a disaster of a picture, but I decided to leave it in to make the point. Inside here, just where I'm putting the pointer there are sprockets, and you have to ensure that the sprocket holes in the film are engaging in that by giving it a little twist when you look in. It's much easier to do on the M. When you get the camera loaded and the film inside and you close it over, a couple of things you have to do. First of all, you have to turn this, which is the rewind knob, in the direction of the arrow to make the film taut. Because later on, you will see when you turn the wind knob, you'll actually see this turning counterclockwise. And that's important because it gives you reassurance that your film is loaded and you're actually shooting frames and not blanks. Here, you also have to set it either to the position before 0 or at 0. I normally set it to 0 and turn it and go to 1. So that way you can keep your film counter going, and you know then when you're getting to the end of a roll. I mentioned earlier on about red dial. This is a red dial on the camera. It's for flash sync, and you turn it around and get the appropriate number. Nowadays, most of these numbers are irrelevant because they were for old bulbs, which are no longer on the market. Only 0 and 20 are for electronic flash. There's a sync connection there. 0 is for shooting at 1/25th, and 20 is for shooting at 1/50th. You'll find this in the old manuals. Moving on to loading film into the M. It's probably a cinch by comparison, and most of you know how to do it. But the earlier M's, the M3 and the M2, actually had separate spools like the LTM models. They also have this back that opens, and you can see the sprockets there, so they're much easier to load. This is from a later model. This is actually an M6. From about the M4 onwards, they had this tulip spool, and you just had to put the film in there and watch it wind. And you could also see the sprockets here. Here you see the sprockets engaging in the sprocket holes in the film. And the other thing you have to do also with an M is you have to look for the rewind button or the rewind lever turning around when you twist it. So practice. I'd say just 2 words here: practice and be comfortable. That's the important thing. Your way of holding a camera is your way. The recommended way is always to hold the camera to hold the lens with your left hand and use that to focus. For vertical shots, there's 2 different ways. You can have the shutter button on the top or at the bottom. I prefer it at the top, but I've seen Leica manuals which recommend both ways. One little thing to watch with earlier collapsible lenses is to make sure it's fully extended and locked by turning clockwise. Every camera is different. You have to get used to it, particularly about the coincidence of the rangefinder. However, I like using zone focus from time to time. It's very liberating. People may be afraid to do that, but you can actually get very good results. And then finally, in terms of focus and press the shutter button smoothly. I think a smooth operation is very important when using an old Leica. The next thing up is exposure. Many ways of dealing with this. The old packets in the old days used to come with what they call the Sunny 16 rule inside. I won't go into that. Lots of people like to go for these Leica meters on their M's. One of the problems with these Leica meters is that nowadays a lot of them, the meter has gone or isn't operating well, or you have problems getting the right batteries. They also mark the top of your camera. But if you want the full 1950s experience with an M Leica, go for these. The one I prefer to use is the Gossen Digi6 here. You just press the button here, get an EV, feed the EV in here, and then you have a range then of apertures and shutter speeds. And you can also, it has this nice string, you can wear it around your neck like a Hollywood film director. On the right-hand side is another method that you can use, which is use your smartphone. I use one called Pocket Light Meter. You just set the ISO and you set the aperture, and it'll give you the time or the shutter speed. I also have another one, which again, like a lot of my other equipment, wasn't to hand the day I actually put together these photographs. It's called the Voigtlander VC2, which has wheels for both shutter speed and aperture, and has LED lights on the top, LED lights. It's a nice meter, but I prefer this because I can see more options at a glance. Just a few tips, and again, I'm not going to give tips to people who've done a lot of film photography. My own method would be largely to bracket maybe, or if I'm going to compensate by no more than 1/3 stop either way with slide film, maybe 2/3 of a stop with negative film. I normally, for a general scene, expose for the midtones, but again, that is something that is for each person's own decision as a photographer. One thing to remember about the older cameras is that the maximum shutter speed will be 1/500 or 1/1000. So with modern emulsions, you will find that using the maximum aperture Peter Carba style on fast lenses is often not possible on bright days. I tend to use a fixed aperture and then change shutter speed, but sometimes when the Irish weather goes off on me, I have to change both. I have a few typical apertures and shutter speeds that I would use here with Portra 160 and maybe a bit more with Tri-X. The important thing is to get to know your camera, your lens, and the film, and it'll come to you. The other point I'll make, and I'll make it again at the end, is that film photography is somewhat different to digital photography. With film photography, you're trying to capture the image to make a negative, and you're not trying to do anything fancy at the get-go. And I think that's an important thing, important difference between the two. Useful accessories. Moving on here now to some winders. On the left-hand side here, we have a Skanu winder, which is from the 1930s. It's a trigger winder. It has a trigger and a tape inside. The main thing about that is it's nice enough to use. You have to make sure it's matched to your camera, or otherwise you have to do more than one wind to make sure that the camera is fully cocked and ready to go. In the middle here, there's a rather large winder here. It's called the Leica Muli. It is a clockwork winder. It's very large, very heavy, and very noisy. You wind it up here. You operate it with the lever here, and there's a lever going around the back. Again, we could probably do a whole session on this to operate the shutter button. This one here actually has 2 shutter speeds. They originally had them marked for 1 frame per second and 2 frames per second, sorry, 2 winder speeds, I should say. And but they took out the 2 frames per second because they felt it was damaging the cameras. But mine actually does it, and it doesn't damage the camera, but I don't use this very often. Finally, on the right-hand side is another trigger winder, which is the like of it. I should have shown the lever coming out here. It's very smooth. This is a larger size here for the C models. And it would probably be my choice of the 3 winders, which are here. Moving on to the M times, and we have electric winders coming in. In this case, the Leica winder M42. This came with an M42 camera, but it actually fits my M4P, which is shown here. Again, a bit like the Muli, it's very large and very noisy. Some people say it jumps about. I may have shot 1 or 2 rolls of film with this, but I've never used it again. As a result of the way they are, but it is historical. It is the very first electric winder for a Leica camera. They're down around 40 bucks. They're rather cheap and easy to get. I would really like to know from somebody who shot more than 1 roll of film with one of these. Another large accessory here is the VisaFlex. This gives you reflex viewing on, in this case, a 3F camera. The 3F camera, which is here, is a 3F red dial. You see how the VisaFlex dwarfs the camera. It's very heavy. This one is actually somewhat primitive in the sense that it has a non-return mirror. You have to reset the mirror every time you use it. But what it does give you through looking through here is a direct view through the lens. I don't feel these are great for walking around photography, but they are good for this application like this, with using a bellows to do close-up photography with this wonderful 65mm f3.5 Elmar. It's right up there with some of the micro Nikkors, and those is a very, very sharp lens. There are loads of accessories to go with these, to go with the bellows and with the VisoFlex. That's an extension tube, that's a chimney finder. There's so many of them. I would say that close-up is probably the main use that I would use a VisoFlex for. Leica had over the years so many close-up solutions. You've already seen them, the dual range Summicron, close focus lenses, etc. That you and the Nuki, that basically they kind of ran out of solutions. This is a very early one called the Beaver. It's from the late 1920s. It holds the camera here by the Elmar lens. You have three close-up lenses, L Pro, L Pic, L Pet, names that may be familiar to some others because these names appeared again and again in the Leica history. The magnification and the coverage you get depends upon the lens you use, the close-up lens, which you put in the front of the Elmar, the length of the legs of the stand, and also the focus of the lens. I've never actually used it in real time, but it's an interesting thing just to look at. Moving on to filters, another useful accessory. I rarely use filters myself. Maybe if I get a UV filter on a lens, I probably would leave it on. Here you have some different color filters, yellow, orange, and yellow, orange, and red would be used typically for somebody who's going to then process in the darkroom only and not scan, because you can actually apply a lot of these filters now in processing software. The first one on the left here is the early yellow filters, which used to fit in the center of the Elmar on this one Model A. These were then replaced by slip-on filters like this UV here, it's called a Fiola. It fitted on the outside of the lens. Moving on then, this is a slip-on lens for a Leica Summer. However, it has a clamp on it. Also, this camera from the 1930s has the pre-war version of the filter for the rangefinder window called this one's black paint one. For black paint fanatics, it is called the Oracle. Moving on again in the development of the filters, here we have a thin screw-in filter for the 90 Elmar here. It's very much like a modern filter. And people who use filters today will be very familiar with the way it works. Here we have a post-war Summicron, which also has a clamp on the UV filter. And finally, we have what are called bayonet filters on the Summerid 50 f1.5 lens on the M3 here, the orange and the yellow versions of both. As I say, you could do a whole seminar on these filters, and there are no shortage of filters to fit Leica cameras, old Leicas. Again, towards the end now, we have to look for something to carry around our camera. Here we have ever-ready cases. We're all familiar with this type of design, but the earliest ones were actually like handbags. This would contain a 1 Model A, it's called the Etron, the bag, a 1 Model A rangefinder inside the lid, and also a cardboard tube in here with 2 rolls or filcas. That's just a different design of the Etron. This one here I'm showing tonight because it's a very, very rare case. I've only ever come across my one, and one in a German book about Leicas written by a lady called Angela von Einem. This has a 1 Model A inside it, and it also has the rangefinder in the top, and it's held in not by a screw here, which fits into the tripod mount, but also a thing like a brass strap on the top. If I had more time, I'd show you the brass strap. Finally, on to outfit cases. Outfit case, this is probably the very first outfit case ever produced by Leica, and there are many of these for old Leica cameras. This is called the Etgam. It's about 90 years old. This is a 1 Model C in it. The lens in the middle, this conical lens, is the Mountain Elmar, which is a lightweight telephoto lens for mounted ears, designed by Leica. It's a 105mm f6.3 lens. 2 features to note here about this camera. First of all, it has a strap. You can carry it on your shoulder. However, I would recommend for going around on a day's photography to use something like a Billingham bag. This is fine for taking your kit from point A to point B, but not for use in the field. And the final feature about this particular case I want to show you is this little key here, which still locks the case. It's like a briefcase or an attaché case. This key has still with the case and still locks it after 90 years. So the key and the case have come together for 90 years. To wrap up then, cameras, a bit like ourselves, can suffer from ailments, bits can fall off and that kind of thing. My own view is generally leave it to the experts. You can do minor external repairs. One thing you can do, for example, if you have pinholes in your shutters, there is a paint can recommend called Deco Textile Black Material Paint, which you paint over and it gets rid of the pinholes immediately. You can do rangefinder adjustment with hand tools. I know people have done it. I've tried it and I definitely would not recommend doing it again. You have to also adjust it both horizontally and vertically. Shutters, I know guys who take photographs of their television screens to adjust their shutters. However, again, I wouldn't recommend it. There's various types of specialized equipment for doing it. My local guy has equipment and can always do it very successfully. The other thing is to be careful with lubricants around lenses. You don't want to get oil on your lens elements or you'll regret it for the rest of your life. And finally, store your camera in dry areas. So on the wrap up, before I show you just a very few photographs, my views are personal, not those of the LHSA. I'm not saying that for legal reasons, but just to explain that everyone has their own way of using cameras. Everyone has their own favorites. My view is if you're really confused about these cameras, take advice, study, and try them before you buy them. You'll have your own way of using it, practice, and be comfortable. Use film and bracket, and you're experiencing the camera, the lens, and the film together. And don't approach it as though it is a film version of a digital camera or vice versa. I can make a full talk out of a lot of these issues that I've given you just on one slide tonight. So before we take some questions, I'd like to just show you some photographs I've taken. The first one here is taken with the LTM 2F red dial with the roll of foam and pan film you saw me loading. This was taken in a very high contrast situation and very dark. I took this about 1/25 or 1/15 and fairly wide open on the lens. I think the foam and pan film has handled this very well and given me what I actually wanted, which was the shape of this tree here on the left-hand side. Here's another one taken on foam and pan film. It's taken with the M6 and the 50 Summicron. It's in a much brighter light. There's more than 50 shades of gray here in this. What you'll see, however, is that the look that you get from Leica, from film, is actually quite different that you'll get, let's say, from a monochrome. But I like the look. I think there's a nicer graduation, as it were, between the different tones in it. You may not agree. It may not be as totally sharp as a digital camera, but you know what Cartier-Bresson said, that sharpness was a bourgeois concept. And finally, a photograph I did not take myself. It came from a roll of film that was in one of my Leica Filcas, with a camera I bought about 5 or 6 years ago. I only got around a few weeks ago with the help of a friend who's got a lot of expertise in this area to develop the roll of film. The pictures on it were taken, I'd say, about 70 years ago, around 1950, in Switzerland. They were taken by a German couple who seemed to be traveling around Switzerland. The camera they were using was probably either a Leica 3 or a 3A, because it came with either of those cameras. I'm not sure which it was. They were traveling in a 1930s BMW with Bavarian plates. The real mystery, I suppose, about this is why was it still in the Filca, and why did they never get the photographs of their trip developed? I'd really love to get these photographs back to the families of these people. I suspect they're not still alive. I would suspect that the woman would be definitely over 90 and the man would be over 100 if he was still alive. And the reason why I'm showing it is to show that Leicas can and do tell stories. So would we like to move on to questions, Richard?
Yes, I think so. I have one. Let me get to it real quick here.
Sure.
Okay, we had one from David Berry. He says, William, I have an M3. The camera shutter speed gets stuck at a tenth of a second and below. Is this something that can be fixed, and who would you recommend?
Well, again, David, it depends where you live. If you're stuck shutter speed, you definitely need to have the camera stripped down and have an expert look at it and also reset all of the shutter speeds. You can't just fix the 1/10. If it's just stuck at 1/10, it means that the shutter mechanism isn't actually not working. And what I'd like to say is that it depends where you are. Do you know where Richard is? The man asking the question?
I don't. If he's on, I encourage you to unmute yourself and answer.
I have my own guy here in Dublin who does them for me. And he's very, very good.
I live in Colorado.
Oh, hello. Hi.
So
How are you? Go ahead.
There may not be somebody in Colorado, but maybe somebody in another state here in the United States that you would recommend.
There are well-known people. Don Goldberg, Yux and Ye. We can maybe put those on the website. What I would suggest is that if you have a local Leica dealer, you can maybe also speak to him about who he would recommend. I had two questions earlier, Richard. Can I take those first before?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Absolutely.
Yeah, I have a question from a James Lebec, which is about the M2, M3 and 35mm choices. I've kind of dealt with that in the presentation by showing the camera with the goggles. For an M3, you can either go with a goggles, the 35 summer on is available in both f3.5 and f2.8 sizes. But you could use other 35mm mount, 35mm lenses with the S-Blue, the little finder on the top. With the M2, you can use any lens, any 35mm lens with an M mount. And the second question I had was from Bill Kybers, and apologies if I misspelled your name, mispronounced your name. It's about the difference between the M6 and the M7. Now, I had stopped before I came to the M7. I stopped at the M6. Some people might regard the M7 as old now, but I would say that the main difference is that the M6 will operate fully mechanically without its batteries. The M7 has automatic exposure, but however, it has exposure which only operates when there is a battery in it. Maybe you're restricted to 1 or 2 shutter speeds, which are mechanical. And the M6, however, will give you a full mechanical range in the event that your battery runs out, and you could use a handheld meter or your smartphone, as I illustrated earlier. Okay, any more questions?
I have one here from George Lane. And he says, the shutter screen on my M3 needed the tension tightened. I found out how to do it and did it myself. It was very simple. Is this recommended, or should I have sent it to someone for repair?
So is that the actual shutter? He says screen and shutter. Is that the shutter, or is it the viewfinder?
The shutter screen in his message.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. Certainly for a shutter itself, I would probably go to an expert. However, if he's finding that he's getting the correct shutter speeds, then maybe he needn't worry. If it's something to do with the viewfinder, that's why the use of the word screen is a bit unusual. Again, if it's working, then you don't need to get it repaired anymore.
This was where you advance the film, and the screen that blocks the light was only opening, was not shutting completely.
I see.
And so the 2 screws had to be tightened that control the tension. Yeah.
Yeah, you can do that, and people do that. there are guides out there, there are books which describe this, and there are guys on YouTube who show you how to do this. If you feel up to the mechanics of doing this, I suppose the important thing is, George, after you had tightened it, were your shutter speeds okay?
Yes.
Well, then you're fine. Then you need worry. The real worry is that you would put off your shutter speeds and you're not getting accurate shutter speeds.
Okay, I have a question from Mike Vicencio. I have an M3 double stroke and single stroke. Which is better as a collectible?
Well, I prefer the double stroke. I have both. One of the features that the double stroke has is also has a glass pressure plate. If it's not scratched or not marked, it's very nice and it's very easy on the film and doesn't mark the film. The other thing is that you can also use, people use these things called a thumbs up, but you can actually, with the double stroke, you actually, after you do the second stroke, you can leave your thumb in, because you do that naturally to ensure that you actually have done the second stroke. And it's probably the origin of the thumbs up thing. I don't use thumbs up with later digital models myself, but I actually like it. I think it's very smooth, and I actually prefer the double stroke.
Okay, and one from Irish Spiegel. I use an Elmarit 90mm, and the aperture has a lovely scalloped surround. The photos are beautifully modeled in the out of focus area. Is this a function of the scalloped surround as opposed to a smooth round aperture?
Well, if you're talking about, there's two things. There's the aperture ring and there is the aperture inside. I presume that what she's talking about is the aperture inside. Sorry, apologies. Are you talking about the aperture inside?
Yes, inside.
Okay. Where will I start on this? There's a lot of lore about this. For example, in the Scimitar lens, I'll refer to some other lenses. First of all, the early ones actually had a round aperture, and it's supposed to give smoother bokeh than the later ones, which have a more octagonal shape. But in fact, I find that some lenses, for example, like the Scimitar, which also have an octagonal aperture, give quite smooth bokeh as well. Again, there's a lot of lore about this. You can only judge this by the results that you actually get. I'm not sure about the change in the aperture in the one you're talking about, the Elmarit, what the exact change was. I thought originally you were referring to the scalloped ring on the lens on the outside, which is just a design feature. Is that your experience? Have you one to compare it with?
No, I'm talking about, I'm using the word scalloped. I'm not sure if that's correct, but a number of my other lights lenses have a smooth, round aperture on the inside. The Elmarit has this, you say octagonal, just a lovely little, I call it scalloped or jagged edge.
Yes.
It creates a wonderful, wonderful frosted out of focus background.
Well, I've written an article about this for the MacPhillis website in the UK. I can put a link onto this if people want to see it, where I showed the difference in the bokeh with the Scimitar lens, because the Scimitar lens had an octagonal aperture, but the original rigid Scimitars actually had a round aperture. And I would say that the collapsible Scimitars with the octagonal actually give nicer bokeh than the round one. It's just, it really is down to taste and experience. Anything else, Richard?
Let's do one more. Gunter Berger says he's interested in an M2. Any hint to be regarded for buying an M2?
Well, I stated my preference earlier to the button rewinds, and they're actually starting to, I know other people who, like myself, are in fact, like the button rewind. It's a very nice, you just press in the button and you rewind the camera. It's very smooth under your right hand. And they're starting to fetch a little bit more money than the lever rewind ones. However, there are, it really is a question, again, of going and trying them out. The most important thing with an M2, however, is probably the viewfinder window. Maybe I didn't mention earlier, but one of the reasons why I like the M3 is that it has 0.91 magnification, whereas the M2 has 0.72 magnification. Again, that's the common one that's generally used through most Leicas thereafter. However, you need to look at the condition of the viewfinder and rangefinder combined. That's key to a good M film camera. And I think if you get a chance to actually examine the camera in advance and see what the viewfinder is, there have been problems with the balsam, which is the glue which is used to actually keep those in place. And sometimes it starts to go and it can cause the viewfinder to go dark and maybe the view not to be as good as it should be. Anything else?
Okay, well, this has been wonderful, William. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us here. Let's give him a round of virtual applause, those of you that are still here.
Thanks.
And we look forward to our next one in a couple of weeks, and look out for some information on that coming up. So, William, thanks again. Everyone stay safe and healthy. And until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.